Hey, so far on this model, I've used a lot of materials, smart materials, procedurals to drive masks and things like that. But I haven't really done any kind of painting inside of Texture or Substance Painter, which is fantastic because it allows Painter actually to take care of about 80% of the work for me, and then I can focus on the 20%, which is really just the detailing, the giving the model some kind of uniqueness, right? So that little human touch is in the last 20%. So that's pretty much what we're going to be doing in this chapter is recreating this material using pretty much what we've done so far, but then getting into the brush system and actually applying that human touch to this model. So let's get to it. So as you can see, what I did here is I deleted the material, and you know what, let me just move the microphone over. So I deleted the material and I'm going to recreate it from scratch. Shelf, smart materials, steel painted, and drag and drop it to the top of the layer stack, and then expand it. Now, after expanding it, you are provided basically with this material here. But you have the base material at the very lowest level, then you have the pores details, which are really a part of the steel, but they provide extra detail for it. So at any time, if you want to remove some of the details like the pores detail, and you want to make the metal a little bit more smooth, then you have that option. There's more flexibility to working this way. And then on top of it, you have the paint. So if you select the paint, it's going to automatically select the fill. And this way, under the properties, you can change the base color, which I do want to do because I want to make sure that the paint is more in line with the rest of the asset. And then I'm going to just drag it over to, like horizontally over to the left until it's just a little bit off white. Now that I'm done with that, I'm going to want to go into the mask. So I'll just click on that and then go into the mask editor. And what I'm really interested in is, if I navigate to about this point here, you'll notice right away that the edge is very even across this part of the asset. And the reason why is because this material is applied based on the curvature mask that has been calculated. And right now, the way it's set up is that it detected all these hard edges, and so this material is there to really show you those hard edges by default. But if you want something a little bit more realistic, you want to have a material that basically has scratched the paint in a bunch of areas, but not across the entire model from every single point of view. It wouldn't make sense that every single one of these edges would be worn, because some of these edges are protected by, for example, the cover, right? So, and at the same time, again, you wouldn't see these kind of this paint being worn so evenly everywhere. So we want to change that up. Under the properties generator, go into the curvature section, and here you are basically presented with a global curvature slider, which controls a bunch of properties, and again, it's basically global for this mask. So now if I lower it down to like 0.61 or something like that, you'll get something like this, which is more realistic now, because now you have it being applied, and it's dinged in some areas but not in others, which is good because now some of the paint actually remains intact. But if you want to refine this, if you want to maybe exaggerate some parts of it, then what you can do is you can go and open up the curvature tab, and here you're going to be presented with more options. And really the most important part for me is just these first like 6 sliders or so. And so what this is levels of refinement that you're provided with, right? So the sharp one affects maybe about 1 pixel of refinement, which if I slide it back and forth, you're not really going to see much of a change. But as you work your way down this list, it affects more and more pixels. So if I go into soft and I increase it, you'll notice that you're finally seeing some change. If you go down to like huge, for example, you're going to wear away more and more paint. So that's basically what it's doing, is you're refining the level of the noise that you get from this mask to a level that you want. And so I think I usually like to have these soft at about halfway, and then medium a little bit more. And now some of the patches are a little bit stronger, but again, there's some parts that have been completely unaffected. Now the nice thing about having this mask generator with all these options is that it also comes with this thing called Ambient Occlusion here. So I'm going to just collapse the curvature, and I'm going to open up the Ambient Occlusion. And so here you're given a bunch of options for that. Now, you know what, let me just close it for a second. So basically, much like the curvature, you're also given a kind of a global slider for ambient occlusion as well. If I drag it over, you'll notice that it's kind of chipping away, or at least it's removing some of the chips from certain parts of the model. And really what it's doing is it's applying the ambient occlusion, right? So whichever parts are occluded by another object, it's going to take away those chips. So instead of having to go in and manually paint that stuff out, you can actually use the ambient occlusion to drive that effect. And so as you notice that as I'm adding more ambient occlusion into this, I'm removing some of the chips from some of those areas. And maybe I don't want to go that high. Maybe I want to stay in or around, maybe 0.2 or something like that. And then I can expand the ambient occlusion tab and then work with the balance and contrast and things like that. So if I work the balance, right, I can basically bring it back to where it was originally. Or if I remove it, then I can do something like that. And as you can see now, I've removed it pretty much entirely from some parts of the model, but then it still remains perfectly intact over here. And then you can do things like inverted as well, right? So you can have anything that's been occluded, you can have the dings over there, but maybe none that have for areas that are exposed. So I'm going to invert that because I want the inverse effect, right? I want most of the scratches happening to the bottom and then almost none happening to the top. I mean, I do want some, but not as many. So again, I'm just going to play around with some of these values here. And then, again, I can always control the curvature artifact too, right? So now that I have less chips happening to the top of the model, maybe I want to bring a little bit more at the bottom. So again, I'm just going to play around with some of these values until I get something that I am personally happy with. And something like this is pretty good. Again, you have a lot less damage on the top, but a lot more damage on the bottom. Very cool. And finally, before we move on to the dirt aspect of this material, we want to scratch it up. So we actually want to have scratches across this model that chip away the paint as well. So it's not just little dings in here across the edges, but also across the surface itself. So for this, I'm going to leave the MG mask editor alone and I'm going to right click and create a new generator. So under the properties, I'm going to go into the mask builder. And under here, I'm going to, first of all, remove the curvature, the grunge, AO, and all that stuff. And I'm actually going to introduce more of that. And then I'm also going to invert the material. And finally, go into the under layers, click on the normal, and go to multiply. And now that we have something like this, I can now control some of the scratches. So as you can see, as I increase the global scratch slider, I'm going to get something like that, where I'm actually seeing some of the scratches. Now, if you want to see these scratches a little bit more clearly, you're probably going to have to go into the texture set settings and increase this to about 4K, and then you're going to see the finer levels of detail. So this is a little bit better. As you can see, you can still see the scratches, but they're much finer now. Now, granted, if you want to work like this, it gets a little bit slow, so I'm just going to go right back to 2K. The thing is, right now, there's a bit of something like this, right, where there's been sort of like a little bit wear off happening to the paint. And I actually want to reserve this for oil and things like that. So right now, I'm actually going to try to remove the grunge. So I'm going to remove the grunge slider. So I basically want to remove all the different types of details out of this mask, and I only want to keep the scratches multiplying over the layers below. And then finally, once I'm done with that, I'm going to open up the tab for scratches and just play around with the numbers of scratches that you have on the surface and maybe the scale. And I don't want to overdo it, right? Because I don't want there to be too many deep scratches on the surface, because what I'm going to want to do later on is actually scratch up the surface in a different way, where there's going to be some oil patches, so there's going to be dirt on top of this, and then those will be kind of scratched off, and there's going to be lots more of that, but the scratches wouldn't have been strong enough to actually wear out the actual paint. So I'm going to play around with this until I get something that I think will work. And in some areas, if you're navigating, you're going to notice that there's a little bit too much happening, like over here, right? Because again, the ambient occlusion would come into play, and it wouldn't allow the surface to be so affected. So maybe using ambient occlusion might actually make sense in some ways, but then again, I'm going to get something like this, and again, this doesn't really make sense. So in my case, the best thing I could probably do is go back into Paint and paint out those kind of details. So again, I'm just playing around with some of these settings here with levels and contrast, and I'm trying to remove any aspects of this that kind of that thin out some of the paint. And I just want to focus only on the scratches, because again, if I put up the levels more, you'll notice that the paint has pretty much been completely eroded, and that is definitely not what I want. And again, if you also do the same thing with contrast, if the levels are a little bit higher, then you'll get that as well to a high degree. So you want the scratches to be introduced and you want to keep them, but you want to keep things subtle. So now we want to paint out some of the scratches that we have here, because in some areas the scratches go like right underneath other details, and quite frankly that wouldn't happen. So let me paint them out. And basically, if you have your paint mask selected, just right click, add a paint layer. So now that's sitting on top of everything else, and because I haven't painted anything yet, this paint layer is 100% transparent right now, and we're going to be painting color into it. So unlike the masks that automatically come with black and white color, and then they override the layers below them, whenever you make a paint layer, it actually doesn't come with any color. It's 100% transparent, and therefore you can actually paint from scratch. So all the detail that we had done so far is still perfectly there. Now by default, your color should be black. So in this case, I would be painting out the material. I don't want to do that. I actually just want to paint out or rather paint some of the paint layer back in. So I'm going to take this grayscale value and I'm going to move it all the way to white, and control right click to change my brush size. And as you can see, if I go over some of these scratches, I can actually remove them just like that. I'm still using my mouse here. And then like right around here where some of these scratches probably wouldn't happen, I'm going to start removing them. And if you want to remove your opacity, if you want to have or paint with a little bit more subtlety, then you can press Control left click to control the flow. And as you can see under the properties, you're controlling basically your flow, opacity, level. Alright, so if I do this, if I go to a really subtle level, you'll notice that it'll fade out the paint, but that really wouldn't happen in real life, so I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to keep the paint a little bit stronger than that. So I'm going to go over these details here and erase them, because they probably wouldn't happen in those areas, and that's pretty good. So now that we've taken care of that, we have scratches exactly where we want them. We have the edge details kind of worn out exactly where we want them. And now it's time to add some, some oil and dirt onto this thing. Alright, so before we add like a dirt layer, for example, I'm going to select the top layer of what I'm working on and then click the paint bucket fill, and that's going to put the layer on top of whatever I was working on instead of putting it within the shader. You can do either or, it doesn't matter. But in my case, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to make sure that this is a dark material, and I'm also going to then turn up the roughness. And now I'm back up in the properties under material. I'm going to turn off metal, normal, and height because I'm not interested in those. And right now it covered everything, which looks like garbage, quite frankly. So under layers, right click the layer and then add a black mask to erase it, and then under the mask, right click again and add a generator, go to properties, generator, and then MG mask builder, and it'll give you something like this. Now you notice the seam, we want to get rid of it. And as previous chapters I've mentioned, if you use triplanar, it's going to get rid of that problem. Now one of my other problems right now is that this mask seems to have completely overwritten a lot of the edges. So wherever I used to have scratches on the surface, and then I would have the steel showing, now I'm actually getting this overriding it. So I don't want that. And in order to do that, I have to go into Curvature and play with the convex range until it removes itself from that area. And then go into the AO and play with the range over there, because you do want it in like wherever there's ambient occlusion, right? You want the dirt to kind of gather up, and just play around with it until you get something that works for you. Okay, and once you get to this point, I'm just going to close down the AO, the curvature, and actually, you know what? Let me increase some of the grunge, like that. Okay, and then finally, one of the more important things is really to take the scratches, take this scratch slider, and then start moving it into the negative space. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that whatever stains or any kind of residue that's on this, if there's been any kind of scratches happening to this surface, then what you're really doing is you're removing it via, because I mean this is dry residue at this point, and any kind of scratches would essentially chip off some of it, but they wouldn't be necessarily hard enough to remove the paint, right? So open up the scratches, maybe perhaps add more of them, make sure the scale is relatively small, so something like that. And then if you're, I mean, once you get something that you like, again, just keep tweaking it. Now, I don't want anything like that. That's a little too strong and it looks, quite frankly, ugly. So just get a value in there that you like. And, I mean, you could add two types of scratches. You could add the darker ones like this and lighter ones like that if you just layer your material. For now, all I'm really interested in is this. But now, this area only has like this very harsh dirt. I want to also add something that's a little bit more soft. So I'm going to add another layer on top of this. Right, so I'm going to select this layer, use the paint bucket, and again, make it relatively dark. Something like that, maybe even darker. Remove the metal normal height, and then add more roughness to it. And again, same procedure as we did before, right? So we're adding a black mask, and then we're adding a generator. And this time I'm going to use the MG dirt. And now that I have this, I can just play around with some of these levels. And again, I just want to kind of add a little bit of softness to the ambient occlusion overall. And if I want, I can just go into the layer editor, and under the blend mode, I might want to, you know, just blend it in or out to something like that. So, I mean, this is a lot dirtier than the other materials that I have here. And so I might actually want to start brushing some of the dirt out. Okay, so we have two layers that essentially add up to some of the dirt. But right now, if you look at the dirt right here, it's just too even. It's just not looking very nice. Some of the stains is just too strong. So, you know what, I actually want to leave the AO layer, because I mean if you turn it on and off it's really subtle, so I want to leave that as it is. And I want to go to the layer below that has all the gunk and scratches built into it. And you know what, I'm actually just going to rename it to Splotches and Scratches, like that. And once I'm on the mask, I'm going to right click and add a paint. And remember that the paint is just a transparent mask, right? So it doesn't actually come with any color built in by default, which is great because it doesn't remove or doesn't replace any of the work that you've done so far with the masks below it. So, and of course my Wacom right click is, or rather middle click is not functioning right now, or rather it's mismapped, so I'm having some issues with it. Okay, now within a paint here, what I want to do is if you go into the shelf brushes, you're going to be presented with this UI, or rather these presets, and I'm just going to pick these scratches too. You can pick any one of these, it doesn't really matter. And then under the paint, I'm going to press Control and left click to make sure that my opacity, now, or flow rather, so as I'm Control and left clicking in my viewport, you'll notice that on the properties slider is moving, and I want to use something really low so that it doesn't, because I want to subtly remove the dirt, right? So if somebody's using a wire brush to clean up the surface, then it would kind of look like this, right? That you're going to be scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing until some of the, until some of the dirt comes off. But you don't want to be scrubbing so hard that the paint comes off, right? So you're just going to be slowly removing it. And then I might actually want to use a smaller brush so I can work it out like that. And you know, just paint it out like so. So I still want to see the stainage, right? I just don't want to, you know, paint it out entirely, right? So I still want to see it in some areas. In some areas, I actually still want the solidness of the sludge, just because, you know what, it might actually be very hard to get there with a wire brush. And again, I'm just going to keep doing that until I get something that looks nice. Now in some parts, as you can see, because the AL was turned on and it was a little too strong in some areas, so they got filled entirely with black. Not what I want in my case. And in this case right now, because I want to remove it faster, I'm going to increase the flow and start painting it out on top like so. There we go. And I'm going to pretend that some areas, you know, like so sometimes this might have actually been disassembled, so they might have actually tried to clean it once before. So maybe even some areas that look like they're inaccessible might actually get some maintenance done or cleanup as well. And that's pretty good. So now we're going to move on to the particle brushes, and I'm actually going to paint in some leaks and some I'm basically going to try to localize some of the details, because right now what we've had is I've used Ambient Occlusion to drive a lot of things, and I've used some of these procedural noises, but I haven't actually used any kind of physicality onto it. So imagine if there's been rain or anything like that layered on top of this. Right now there's really been nothing. So that is what I'm going to layer on next. Yeah. Now, I will want to tweak some of this stainage a little bit on my own time, but for the sake of this video, I just want to move on. So we have the layer, the fill layer that controls the ambient occlusion that I don't want to touch. We have the splashes and scratches that controls, well, just that. And now if I select the layer on top and then I create a new layer, now I'm going to want to get into the particle brushes to paint and add some kind of physicality to it. So as I did before, the base color, I want it to remain relatively dark. Get rid of the metal, normal, and height, and then take the roughness maybe to like 0.6 or something like that. And then once again add a black mask, and then add a this time a paint layer. And now go into the particle brushes, right? So under your shelf, just go to particles and pick something like rain. And I'm just going to use the default settings in this case and start painting on this object. Now, if I do this, the paint brush is kind of finicky in terms of scale. And not only that, but it's very, very subtle. So you have to actually hold it for a very long time in order to get anything out of it. And so I'm actually just going to time-lapse this thing. And you know what? That's pretty good. So now the rain is very subtle, and there's two things I want to do to it. One, I actually want to add a little bit of levels to increase the contrast of what I just did, right? So under the mask, right-click and go to add levels. And I'm just going to play around with the levels until I get something more contrasty. Something like that. And next, what I want to do is I want to once again click on the mask and then go add a filter. And this filter is going to warp some of those lines, because right now they're very straight, right? And the thing is with rain is that usually what happens is most surfaces have some kind of dirt on them, right? I mean, there's always all sorts of dust and things that that are out in the real world. There's like sand particles and things like that. And usually what happens is when it rains, it starts to kind of like clean up the surface, but then the dirt kind of piles up. So and it does it in a very not uniform way. So I'm going to pick the warp, and I'm going to sort of warp that effect. So I'm going to go into the intensity and increase it. So you'll see that right now it's adding that kind of warp to it. And you don't want to use anything too heavy like this. This is just going to make it look like frosted glass. you want to just make sure that you increase it up until the point where it starts to lose the linear feel of it, but not much further than that. And then if you want, you can add another paint layer and paint out some of the mask altogether. So we have that. Now let's try to, maybe even add another paint layer for maybe not rain, for something else, right? So again, dark. I want to remove metal, normal, and height. And then black mask. And this time I'm actually just going to paint some of the leaks and leaks heavy and things like that onto it. So it's going to localize that to only a few areas that I'm interested in. And then again, I could clean it up, scratch it out, and do whatever. So add paint, and then paint with, I don't know, leaks, and see what happens. And it's painting it very, very strong. So you might want to remove some of the flow, if you get to go down into the properties, play around with some of the settings. So you have the spawn speed, there's a rate factor, so maybe remove it. And again, you could test it here, right? So like, is this something that you like? You know what? But it's really best to just do it on the actual surface. So this is a little bit better than what we had, right? Because when the rate factor is too high, then it's going to give you something like that, and it's just going to completely kill and overwrite everything very quickly. In some instances you want that, but I usually like to work a little bit more subtle than that, right? So in this case I get some of these streaks, which are pretty good. And I'm just going to very quickly just move across the model like that. Just a few strokes here and there. And then I can change the opacity overall. Right, because I don't want anything too strong. I could actually do the same thing with the rain. Again, I want to keep things nice and subtle. I don't want to just have this, all this black color everywhere. And then, of course, if you're interested, then you could, once again, just start painting it out by adding another paint layer. And then choosing a brighter color to paint out with, because right now I'm pretty sure we were painting with white. So if I go into my brushes and I select something like one of these fur or the dirt brushes, right now we're painting with white. So if I choose white, I'm going to dirty it up. So I actually want a negative color and paint out some of the effect that I have. So let me left click and make it more subtle. Let me right click to make it smaller, and then paint out some of what I just painted in. And then do the same thing for this layer here. Right click, add paint. Maybe even introduce more of it until at least, until I see it, and then paint it out wherever it doesn't work. Again, it's all about just layering some of these effects on top of one another, but then trying to paint it out and keeping it as like relatively subtle. And finally, I want to add some of the like dents and things like that into this object. But before I do that, I want to show you something, and that is if you press Shift and then right click, you can actually rotate the environment around without having to go into the viewer settings. As you can see, as I'm right clicking, Shift right clicking, you can see the viewer settings slider constantly shifting, right? And the reason why you want to do that at a certain point is just so that you can actually see how some of the highlights and surfaces are actually working. So as I'm doing this, and if you go slowly through it, you'll notice that some of the material properties are showing up very nicely. And you know what? If you go into solo, you can probably see it even better, because you can get into those angles that are easier to access without having some of the rest of the model kind of get in the way. And as you can see, this area right here, let me choose something a little harsher for a brush. So this area right here, if I right click or shift right click and I move it, you can see that there's a lot of shininess in there. Okay, and then some other parts of the model are not receiving anywhere near the level of shininess that I might want. So I might actually want to go back into splotches and scratches, and then go into the mask builder and maybe increase the amount of scratches that I have, or rather not the scatter, but let me zero that out. and then maybe increase some of the scratches that I have, right? I might want to increase some of the grunge or whatever. I mean, like, you might want to work it in a little bit more. Maybe go back to the paint and go into some of these mask builder, mask editors, and play up the curvature a little bit more, so that you might want to erode some of the paint off it, right? So that this way, now when I right click and shift, you'll notice that some of the parts of the model are shiny that I maybe might want it to be more shiny, right? And if in case you don't want to edit or affect the overall curvature, maybe you want to go into the curvature settings and affect how, you know, the refinement of the mask overall, right? And again, right click and shift and see how it's actually playing with the light, right? And this is much better because now I'm seeing a little bit of this edge come back up. So that's one thing that you could possibly do at this stage, is start tweaking. Like, once everything's kind of been laid out, you have the rain layer, you have some oils, and you've cleaned it up and things like that. Then you could go back into your levels, and you could go back into your mask builders and kind of tweak it so that everything works, right? Because up until this point, you've been laying down the foundation, but you really didn't have an idea of how everything was going to look when it's all kind of been put together, right? Once everything's laid out, then you could start tweaking, refining, removing, adding, and so on. But anyways, like I said, now I'm going to be moving on to the height and actually painting some of the localized scratches that won't necessarily only come with having like purely a baked out curvature map, right? Because that's going to automatically detect certain edges and that's it. But what if I want to have some surface scratches? Well, by default you wouldn't get that, so we have to do that manually. So before I add a tint layer, I'm going to go all the way down into the steel painted, go select the paint layer, and actually I'm going to increase the height just a little bit so that it separates itself from the steel. Right, so I'm going to add some thickness to the overall paint. And it still looks kind of like garbage, but it's okay because, again, the resolution is not being rendered at its fullest. And even then, you could, I mean, for example, you could go to 4K here, but when you're actually exporting, you could go to 8K. Now, once that's done, I'm going to go back all the way to the top, add another layer, and then subtract color, metal, rough, normal. I'm only interested in the height at this point. And then add a paint layer, and then do the same. I'm really only interested in the height. And once you have that, pick a brush, right? So go into the brushes, pick one of the maybe scratch brushes, for example, and then start painting. So you should get something like that. Now, if the level of height, or like if the dentage is too much, then you just have to adjust the height value over here that you're painting, and it will make it more subtle or not, right? I mean, this is basically under the brush menu. As long as you have a brush selected, you can paint, or you can choose the value that you want to paint with and get something like that. And then again, you want to localize some of these dents, right? You don't want to just, you know, go to town and paint it everywhere, because that's just going to make it look like garbage, right? But I know for a fact that like this surface would come in contact with other surfaces here, and so there might be a lot of dents. Other parts of the model might come in contact with different kinds of surfaces, and there might be different kinds of damage, right? So I might want to change up my brush altogether and maybe remove some of the spacing, because right now what I'm doing is, if you'll notice that right now, if the spacing is set to very low, you have a lot more instances of your stamp, right? A lot more, yeah, basically a lot more dots. So as I'm making a single stroke, it's going to place a lot of instances, right? But if I up the spacing, then I'm going to place one, and then notice how long it takes me before I actually get another instance. And so sometimes if you're going to be stamping details, it's a little bit easier if you just up the spacing a whole bunch. And then under the properties alpha, I'm going to change it up to another image, another stamp, and I'm going to use something like drips. So let's put that down, and right now it's set to use a varied angle, and that's under the properties angle jitter. Right, so anytime you want any kind of variety to your material, like for example your size jitter, so as you're painting it's going to change the size of the brush. If you don't want that, remove that. So every single time you place it, it's always the size of your brush. So now you can control it using the control right click or the size, right? So whatever you set it here, that's exactly what the size of the instance is going to be, and there's not going to be zero variety. And at the same time, if you want to make sure that you control the exact angle, then remove the angle jitter, and then this way you know exactly what angle you're going to get, you know exactly what size you're going to get, and then you could start placing it. But again, you got to work with some kind of height, right? So place it like that, and like that, and you're going to want to affect or choose some kind of angle sometimes, only because of the fact that sometimes you might want to rotate your viewport, and now you can see that the angle that I was working with before, which was working horizontally like this, is not going to work because now my brush is it's always vertical, right? So I still want my scratches to go this way and not vertical from this angle. So I want to go into the angle of my brush, rotate it about 90 degrees, right? And then do something like that, or maybe even actually 90 degrees this way. So, and I'm just going to paint a bunch of stamps. And if this brush isn't what you want, then choose a different one, right? Choose a different alpha. So maybe if I go down here, there might be another brush that works better. Like, and let me actually find something that might work better. Maybe these scratches here. So as you can see, these are finer scratches. And again, I have to go back into the angle, choose 90 degrees. And I'm just going to paste a whole bunch of these. And right now, it's actually not working again. I have to turn it off. I have to undo a bunch of it because the size jitter and angle jitter is up too high. So I want to make sure that I'm only painting in one direction. Just like that. So this is looking pretty good. I mean, it's got some denting here, right? It's got the shininess around it. Yeah, it's got the stainage, it's got some leaks and things like that. So this is looking okay. And you know what? I think I'm gonna finish this chapter with that. So, cheers.